All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for tuning in this week. We have another talk from our friends down at the University of South Carolina. Elie, Jose, and Jorge have been generous with their time this past year and in the past to give us updates on their research. And some people may have tuned in for their talk on their cyber infrastructure training grant that was developing infrastructure to help with trying to teach people how to use different components of CI. This, I think, is related in a way that they've been doing a little bit of research into the BBR protocol. So I'm going to turn it over to Elie and Jose to give the talk, and Jorge is here as well. And hopefully they'll be able to give a little bit of insight into this. I know we've had some talks from Google and from ESNet in the past, so I'll turn it over to you guys.
Thank you, Jason. So this is Jorge, and I will start the presentation, but then I will let Elie and Jose to continue. They are Elie and Jose are graduate student at the University of South Carolina, and they perform this work. I helped them a little bit. I'm a faculty member in the IT department here at the University of South Carolina. So we evaluated BBR version 2 that was last year, and we want to recognize Neil Cardwell. He's one of the authors of BBR version 2. He was helping us with the evaluation, so he gave us a very helpful comments and suggestions. So Elie, can you go to the next? So we will start with a very brief introduction to TCP loss-based congestion control, BBR version 1, version 2. What are the design goals? Again, briefly, we will focus mostly into the experimental results and then to the conclusions. As you might know, the idea of BBR is to mitigate or solve this problem that is observed when we have the additive increase, multiplicative decrease form of control. And that leads to very poor performance in terms of throughput when we have large round trip times and even a minimal packet loss rate. So BBR version 1 was published in 2016, and it produced high throughput in the presence of packet losses. However, it shows some performance issues. Examples: unfairness with loss-based congestion control, Reno, cubic; low throughput for loss-based congestion control; high packet loss rates when the buffer size is smaller than 1.5 BDP; and throughput variation that has to do with fairness. BBR version 2 tries to solve or mitigate some of these problems, improve coexistence with loss-based congestion control algorithm, avoiding the buffer bloat problem, minimizing the time to reach an equilibrium point. That means trying to get as soon as possible, as quick as possible to a fairness point, reduce the variation of throughput, and produce high throughput even with moderate packet loss rates. So what we decided to do is to test BBR version 2. And we prepare, first we work with an emulated network. We use Mininet, and we tested using a variety of number of flows, from 2 flows all the way to 100 flows working simultaneously in the network. So in the diagram that we have at the bottom, we have 100 senders, 100 receivers, and then we start modifying some parameters. Those parameters are the packet loss rate, the delay, and also we emulated different active queue management policies. By default, we use the tail drop, which is the simple one, but then we start playing with others as well. So all the experiments took 300 seconds, and we conducted many. I think Elie and Jose conducted at least 10 of each, and then averaged the results. So CPU cores were over provisioned so that always the CPU utilization is below 50% of utilization. And we did this because having an idle CPU time is a good fidelity indicator. So if you are working with Mininet, you want to have fidelity. So it's you get good results. And one way to achieve that is to keep the CPU utilization low. So the bottleneck link was 1 gigabit per second. And here we have router R2. The output, the interface facing the bottleneck link is where queues will be formed. We have router R1, the loss delay emulator. And then we have all the servers. We have the sender, receivers, and we use iPerf. We also use some other tools, for example, TC, to choose the active queue management mechanism. All other links were 40 gigs. So clearly in router R2 output interface, the interface facing the bottleneck link is where the queues will be formed. So Elie, I will let you, unless you want me to continue, but you did this test, so I will let you continue.
Thank you, Doctor. So for this first test, what we did is we have 100 simultaneous flows, and the propagation delay that we configured was 20 milliseconds. All of these flows are using the same congestion control. The bottleneck here is 1 gigabits. And we calculated the cumulative distribution function, or CDF, the mean, standard deviation, and the fairness. And for this test specifically, we did not emulate any packet losses. So what we can see is that when the buffer size is small, for example, 0.01 BDP and 0.1 BDP, the average throughput of BBR exceeds cubic, and it's really closely related to the throughput of BBR1. And what we can see is that when we have small buffers, cubic has the lowest throughput and the lowest link utilization. And this is because, we have small buffer, and then we have frequent packet losses. And this will lead us to have a poor link utilization.
I will interrupt 1 second, Elie. Just 1 second. So this curve is throughput on the x-axis, CDF, cumulative distribution function, on the y-axis. Really what we want is something near 10 megabits per second for all, right? And what Elie is describing is the average for cubic is 6.8, then that is megabits per second. The average for BBR is 9.4 for BBR version 1 and 9.1 for BBR version 1. I'm referring to the first scenario. So that's what we see. Sorry, Elie, you can continue.
Yeah, thank you for the clarifications. Yeah, and what we've seen as well is that both BBR1 and BBR2 have a fairly good fairness index, and the fairness index that we calculated here is the Jane fairness index. This means that we have low throughput differences between those flows. Now, when we increase the buffer size to 1 BDP, what we can see is that both BBR1 and BBR2 have high throughput with a mean of 2.2, and also an acceptable fairness. For BBR1, it's high, 94, and for BBR2 is 83. However, when we increase further the buffer, so for 10 BDP and 100 BDP, although BBR1 and BBR2 have high throughput, for example, 9.1 for BBR1 and 9.9 for BBR2, we can see that the fairness index start decreasing significantly. which means that the flows are not really sharing the bottleneck bandwidth equally. This is the same test. However, what we did is we emulated 1% of packet loss rate. So this is done through NetEm. We did this is injected manually, and what we can see is in all the different buffer sizes that we have, Cubic has a low throughput, and because Cubic is very sensitive to packet losses. However, with BBR1 and BBR2, we can see that the throughput is high even with small buffers. So 0.01 BDP, we have around 9.3 and 9.1 for BBR1 and BBR2. However, again, as we keep increasing the buffer size, for example, for 10 BDP and 100 BDP, we will start seeing problems with respect to fairness. And this issue is not shown in Cubic because really they are all competing on a very small amount of bytes. So that's why you see a fairness index high for Cubic, but it's not the case for BBR, whether 1 or BBR2. Another test that we did is to see how fair BBR2 is with Cubic, with a loss-based congestion control. And what we have here is heat maps for the fairness. And basically, we have in this test 2 flows, 1 Cubic versus 1 BBR2 flow. And each entry here in the heat map, you will see 3 numbers. So the link utilization is at the center top. And then the bandwidth used by Cubic is the bottom left. And the bandwidth used by BBR2 is the bottom right. So we have the test, we have the results for 0.1 BDP, for 1 BDP, and for 10 BDP. In the heat map, what you can see, the columns are the different propagation delays that we configured. And the rows here are the bottleneck bandwidths. So here we use different bottleneck bandwidth rather than just the 1 gigabit as we did in the previous test. So what we can see first is that really with a buffer size that is small, 0.1 BDP, we can see that generally the fairness index is low. And even with small BDP values, for example, here at the upper left of the matrix, we can see that BBR2 is allocated more bandwidth than Cubic. Now, when both the propagation delay and the bottleneck bandwidth increase, or in other words, when the BDP increase, when we have a large BDP, then we can see that the fairness index decreases significantly. As you can see here as an example, BBR2 grabbed all the link and nothing was allocated to Cubic. If we take the other extreme case, so we have a larger buffer, 10 BDP buffer, a large buffer, we can see that we have kind of better fairness than the smaller buffer. However, also when we increase the BDP, you start see a very poor performance in fairness. And with the smaller values of BDPs, what we can see here is that Cubic is grabbing more of the bandwidth than BBR2. So this is in contrast to what we see here with the small buffer. And here again, those are the same results, but now we emulated a 0.01% packet loss. And also, overall, we see the very, very similar results to without packet losses. So again, the share here of Cubic is high when we have a high buffer size, but it's low when we have a smaller buffer size. Another test that we did to test the coexistence of BBR2 with Cubic is the following. So what we have is a 1 gigabit per second link and 20 millisecond propagation delay. And we have the competing flows sharing the same bottleneck link. So what we have in the first graph here, we can see that on the x-axis, we have the different buffer sizes that we configured. And on the y-axis, we have the throughput for the two below graphs. And for the upper graph, we have the fairness. So for example, in the middle graph, we have cubic versus BBR1. And you can see at the upper graph, you see the fairness index for this test. So which would be here in this case, the yellow line. And what we've seen here is that when the buffer size is small, so for example, below 1 BDP and below, when we have cubic and BBR1, the fairness is poor. You can see that BBR1 grabs most of the bandwidth and leaving almost nothing to cubic. However, this behavior was improved with BBR2. So you can see that it's not 100% fair, but we can see an improvement with fairness. And almost all the time, the values are above 75% here. But then when we start increasing further the buffer, we see that cubic started grabbing more and more the bandwidth, and then we will see that we will result again in a low fairness index. So the other test here, we have emulated the 0.01% packet loss, also for two flows, but then we tested when we have more flows to see the effect. So figure C here is where we have 100 flows without losses, and when we have 100 flows in figure D, but with 1% packet loss. And as we can see here, we can still see the problem when we have large number of flows with respect to fairness, even with BBR2. What we can see is that it is improved when we compare it to BBR1, but it's not ideal, I would say, especially when we increase the buffer size to very large values. Another metric that we try to evaluate is the RTT unfairness. We know that with traditional congestion control algorithms, they favor flows with small RTTs. But with the literature, we've seen that BBR1 allocates more bandwidth to flows that have larger RTTs. And what we have here is a test where we have two simultaneous flows, one with 10 milliseconds and the other with 50 milliseconds, just to have this unfairness in the round trip time. And figure A and B consider the regular tail drop policy. And what we can see is that, for example, for BBR1 in the first figure, for low values, we have, for low values of the buffer, configured buffer, we have good fairness, approximately 100%. But then we see that the flow with the larger RTT started grabbing more. The same test now for BBR2, we can see that it's much better. So the fairness overall is improved even with larger buffers. And approximately the fairness was almost always above 80%. So this is the behavior that we've seen when we have a regular, very simple tail drop policy. But then what we try to do is we try to activate a more complex policy, such as the FQ coder. And what we've seen is that it was able to completely mitigate the problem of RTT unfairness, regardless of the buffer size that we have. Another test was to verify one of the design goals of BBR2. So one of the design goals was to improve the loss rate and the retransmissions. So what we decided is to kind of reproduce the test that was reported in the literature. And really here what we can see is that BBR1, when we start increasing the number of flows with more flows, we have high retransmission rate. And the buffer size that we use here is a small buffer, 0.02 BDP. So the propagation delay is 100 milliseconds. And again, we see that BBR1 will keep increasing its loss rate with more flows. BBR2 has higher loss rate than cubic, but much, much lower than BBR1. And it's important to note here is that even though we have a higher retransmission rate, than cubic in BBR2, but we are maintaining here the full link capacity, which wasn't the case as we showed before for cubic. Another test is also another objective, which is the queuing delay when we have bloated buffers or large buffers. Here in this test, we have 2, 10, 25, and 50 flows. All of them use the same congestion control. And the bottleneck is 1 gigabit. Propagation delay is 30 milliseconds. The reported round trip time in this test here on the y-axis includes, of course, the queuing delay. So it's the queuing delay and the propagation delay. And these are the different buffer sizes that we configured. So we have 1 BDP, 10 BDP, 50, and 100 on the x-axis. So what we can see is that really BBR1 and BBR2 in all the cases, so no matter how many flows we have to a certain extent, of course, we maintained low queuing delay, and that's why we can see that the round trip time is close to the propagation delay. However, this is not the case with cubic, and we can see that once we increase the buffer with cubic, which is a well-known fact, we start having more and more queuing delays, and that hence our round trip time will increase. Another test is the throughput and retransmission functions of the packet loss rate. So here what we have is a single flow. The bottleneck is 1 gigabits and the propagation delay 100 milliseconds. On the x-axis here, we have the loss rate that we configured. And on the y-axis for the first graph, we have the throughput. And for that same test, we can see the second graph shows the retransmission rate. So what we can note here is that with different levels of loss rates for BBR1 and BBR2, and specifically for up to 0.1, we can still have very high throughput. Now for BBR1, even with 1%, we can still get full throughput, but BBR2 starts decreasing. And of course, as we increase further the packet loss rate, both of them will have a lower throughput. However, if you want to compare those to the loss-based congestion control, we can see that even with very, very small amount of losses, we get low throughput with cubic. And also the retransmission is improved. So as we can see here, with all the different loss rates that we configured, BBR2 maintained much lower retransmission rate than BBR1. Now the same case, we did it for a larger buffer for 1 BDP, and we kind of got the same or somehow similar results. But the idea here is that BBR1 tolerate more losses, but BBR2 tolerate now more than cubic and is able to perform adequately, and I would say very well when we have acceptable loss rates. Another metric we computed is the flow completion time. The flow completion time really is how much time does it take for a transfer to be complete. And what we did here is we tested with 100 simultaneous flows using the same congestion control. And the bottleneck again is 1 gigabits, but now we have 20 millisecond propagation delay. And the first graph here shows the results when we don't emulate packet losses. The x-axis is the buffer size, and the y-axis is the flow completion time in seconds. And this is the flow. This is the completion time for a flow of 10 gigabytes of transfer. So what we can see is that when we have short buffers, so 0.1 BDP, because cubic has a lot of losses, we can see that the flow completion time increases. However, as we increase further the buffer size, we can see that all three congestion control algorithms have almost the same flow completion time. And note here that we have 100 flows, and that's why if it was small buffer, we are still getting good performance in cubic. You know, the famous buffer sizing formula, which says that the buffer size should be equal to the bandwidth delay product over the square root of n. So here we have a large number of flows, and that's why we are getting good results with cubic. Now, when we introduce some more losses, so 0.01% loss rate, the performance of BBR1 is not affected. BBR2 slightly affected with short buffers, nothing significant. But for cubic, definitely we have much lower throughput because now we are even adding more the losses, and therefore the completion time for a flow to be transferred will take longer. So also want to increase further the test and see what happens when we have 100 simultaneous flows, but now we have 50 cubic flows competing with 50 BBR1 flows, and then we have 50 cubic flows competing with 50 BBR2 flows. And each flow is completing 100 megabytes of data transfer. So the upper graphs here from A to E, they show cubic and BBR2, and the lower graphs show cubic with BBR1. Here we did not emulate any losses. And as we can see, it's always the case where BBR2 has a lower flow completion time than cubic, and even with larger buffers like 10 BDP, we can still see that BBR2 performs well and has better flow completion time, even 100 BDP as well. And the same thing you can see when we have BBR1 competing with cubic rather than BBR2. Also, almost all the cases that we've tested, we've seen that BBR1 completes the transfer much faster. These are the same tests now again, but we introduced 1% packet losses. And as we can see now, the throughput of cubic and all the graphs that we see here is significantly affected. We increase the loss rate, so definitely we have a higher flow completion time for cubic. But what we can see is that for BBR2 and BBR1, the flow completion time is not affected by the introduced losses. And here we are introducing 100%, which is considered a high packet loss rate. So that's why we can see that really BBR1 and BBR2 perform really well, even with the different rates. Up to 1% for BBR2 works very well. Further, it starts decreasing as we've seen in the previous tests. Another test that we did is we need to see what impact we have on fairness when we deploy different active queue management algorithms. So here in this scenario, we have a bottleneck of 1 gigabits, 20 millisecond propagation delay again. But we have an uneven composition of flows. So for instance, for the first graph, we have 1 BBR2 versus 1 cubic, but then we have 1 BBR2 versus 10 cubic, and then 10 BBR2, 10 cubic, and 50 BBR2, 50 cubic flows. For these tests, we considered 4 different AQMs. The first is the simple one that we've been using, the tail drop. And then we used a more recent AQM that is very active, and especially in the buffer bloat community, Cake and FQCodal. And also we activated the ECN with FQCodal in one of the tests just to see how BBR2 reacts to ECN. By the way, just to mention very briefly that BBR2 now accepts ECNs, considers ECN marks. BBR1 didn't consider at all ECN, so that's why we added this this AQM here. And really, what we can see is that for all different buffer sizes that we configured, the fairness for all the flows, for all the different composition of these flows, were 100% if you are using an advanced AQM. So in other words, if we are not using the tail drop AQM. However, with AQM, with the tail drop AQM, we have lower fairness, and this is precisely shown when we have larger buffers. So bigger buffers with tail drop will produce very bad or very low fairness. And then because we've seen that the dynamics of BBR whether BBR1 or BBR2, they use pacing to space the packets, and basically when they estimate the sending rate, they pace at a certain value of that estimation. So we wanted to see what impact does fixed rate pacing have on loss-based congestion control. And when we say here fixed rate, it means that we manually specified what is the pacing rate for each of the flows, rather than just activating pacing by itself. So for this test, we have 100 simultaneous flows. Bottleneck is 1 gigabits and 20 millisecond propagation delay. And what we did is we set the pacing rate for each flow to 8.5 megabits. Remember, we have 100 flows, so this would be a total of 850 megabits. And we intentionally use a smaller value than 10 megabits just to leave a headroom, because this will help us more and not overfilling the queues and overloading the links. So what we can see for in the first graph here, so when we don't have losses, so if we took at the red and the green, when we don't have losses, we have a high throughput. And here we didn't activate pacing, which means that it's always trying to figure out what is the maximum a certain flow can transmit. So they are competing, and therefore a queue is being formed. But when we talk about throughput here, we can see that it has a very high throughput. However, when we activated pacing, because we are using a lower pacing rate, we can see that the throughput is slightly lower. Now, when we have, if I want to consider the case where we have packet losses, we can see that pacing generally helps with the throughput. So the yellow here shows, the yellow line shows that we don't have pacing, but we have losses. And here the blue one shows the opposite. So we have pacing. Now, if we look at the second graph, which really shows why the importance of pacing here, even though we got a lower throughput, we can see that the fairness and the round trip time, which is shown in the third figure, is much better when we activate the pacing. Now, if we want to be very realistic, it's not going to be the case where we can always determine what is the right pacing rate and hard code the value manually, because the load on the network will change. But this is just like a kind of a motivation for future congestion controls if they want to consider pacing as part of their internal mechanism. So as we can see, because here we are not using pacing and we don't have losses, what happens is that with bigger buffers, again, the fairness decreases, but also we can see that the round trip time will also increase. So if you want to think about it in a way that this kind of trade-off and the throughput, which is very small, gave us really really good results in the fairness and the round trip time. So as a conclusion, we studied BBR2 in a network where mostly we use 1 gigabits per second, and we try to study it basically in an emulated environment. So everything is executed on Mininet and network namespaces in Linux. And what we've seen is that indeed BBR2 addressed a lot of the limitations of BBR1. We've seen, for example, when we talk about loss rates, BBR2 tolerates much more than cubic, but less than BBR1. It mitigates the RTT unfairness issue. It has better coexistence with cubic, and we've seen that in a lot of different scenarios. It has lower retransmission rates than BBR1. And even when we have bloated or large buffers, we can still have very good queuing delays. And the coexistence and the fairness problem with cubic is not completely solved, but we would say it's more mitigated. Another point here is that we have the full paper if you want to go into the details and see more results. And just to be more contributing to BBR2 and to congestion control in general, we kind of opened the scripts so anyone can go to this GitHub repo. We have the virtual machine there and all the scripts, so you can reproduce all the results and you can tweak if you want to test with other kind of scenarios. The BBR2 version that we used is the alpha version in 2019. And that's it. If you have any question, just let me know. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you all for going through that. Really promising work. I think that this protocol has come a long way since the first time that we had a talk on this from Matt Mathis, I think 3 years ago at this point. So we'll open up the floor for questions. I know that there's some others on the call that have experimented with this, and they may have some things that they want to add in. So I jotted down a couple here. So it seems like certainly there's been a lot of protocol release. When is there going to be another update to the protocol made? I haven't been following the development very closely, so maybe you guys have some insight to that.
There is a more recent version actually than the one that we reported here, because what really happens that we started late 2019, early 2020, and back then this was the only version. But now there's a newer update that even has better results, and there is the mailing list of BBR. If you are interested, you can join there. It's a very active group. A lot of people share their results there, and every time there's a new version, they announce it. What we can say for sure is that there's a more recent version than this one. We didn't try to see how different it is from the one that we tested, but based on the other experiments that were conducted by people in the community, it was shown that it has some improvements, but very slight improvements over this one.
Okay. So Ezra has the first question here. Have you looked at BBRv2 and Cubic together over non-bottlenecked paths? I think it was mentioned your test bed was all 40 gig. Have you experimented without the bottleneck?
No, actually, we just considered the case where, yeah, they are both bottlenecked on the same link. We did not try it the other scenario. But it's definitely worth checking and see how they can perform together. But yeah, all the tests that we reported here are competing over one bottleneck, the 1 gigabits, and the links are 40 gigs. So yeah, I'm not sure about that really.
Okay. And with your test bed, you have a lot of flexibility to sort of do complex topologies using a Mininet and the setup that you have there, right?
Right. Yeah, it's. I would say it would be fairly simple to do that. And really, if you think about it, all we are doing is just one command that will set the bottleneck link capacity and the buffer size. So with Mininet, because it allows you to do this separation of the network namespaces or the network resources, you can very, very easily construct even more complex topologies. And I also want to point out that the scripts that we have here on the GitHub repository, if you are interested in such scenarios, it's very simple to modify them for this specific purpose. So nothing will change. It's just a matter of changing the topology. All the other tests will run exactly as they were written. So it's going to have minimal changes, I would say. But yeah, it's easy to test it in Mininet, and it's definitely worth trying and see what we can get.
Okay. So Brian Tierney is actually asking to be unmuted because he doesn't want to type in his questions. So hold on, Brian. Let me unmute you here. All right, Brian, you should be able to ask your question.
Okay, great. Thanks. Yeah, I've got a bunch of short questions, and it'd be hard to type them all in. And they might be, this might be more just suggestions for future work, but I was wondering if you've done any comparisons of 1500 byte MTUs versus jumbo frames?
We didn't.
This is all 1500, I'm assuming.
Yeah, this is the 1500. We tried. Well, I mean, we did some experiments before with cubic and the impact of the maximum segment size, and yeah, we've seen a lot of different results. But specifically for BBR2, we didn't do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've started doing a little bit of testing of that, and somewhat surprising to me, it seems like jumbo frames are more stable than 1500 byte MTUs, but I've only just started doing that, so I was wondering if you had any results.
Yeah, that's definitely something to test.
And then the other thing that I've started testing lately, and some surprising results, is at really short RTTs, like between a half a millisecond and 2 milliseconds. Often cubics, it just seems to be considerably better than BBR 1 or 2. And I was wondering if you've done much testing at the shorter RTTs.
We didn't actually. When you say better in terms of throughput, in terms of what did you see in better?
Both in terms of throughput of single streams and throughput of competing streams. Cubic actually seems to win often at like a 1 millisecond round trip time path. So, and your test environment is a little bit different than mine, so it'd be interesting to see if you see the same thing as we do. I'm also using NetM for delay.
Yeah. Elie, you have the matrix there. You have that result in the matrix. So if you go to that slide, you might have something that shows that cubic has better. So if you look at, not very sure, but at least, at least in the middle, you have the B1 BDP. You have that, let's say 20 milliseconds and 20 megabits per second of bottleneck bandwidth. You have a little bit better of cubic, right? Grabbing more bandwidth.
Yeah, well, if you do some tests at like 1 and 2 millisecond RTT, which is of course 0.5 and 1 millisecond delay, I'd be curious to see those results.
Yeah, thank you for these suggestions. We'll definitely try them. I mean, considering more and more different test scenarios.
And then I guess my last question is, I think it's really interesting the way you're plotting everything using buffer size as the x-axis. I hadn't thought of doing that, and I really like that. Based on all that, do you have any recommendations on like what size buffers, if you're buying new network hardware, and I guess anticipating BBR in the future, do you have any intuition, on just how much bandwidth delay you want to buy?
We don't have hard numbers, exact numbers, and I think this is still an open problem, even with the loss-based congestion control. But what we can see is that for BBR1, or BBR1 and BBR2, if you are considering short buffers, most of the time it would be enough.
And maybe even better, not just enough, but actually maybe an advantage, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Definitely it will improve the queuing delay. And as you've seen, when we increase the queuing delay, you will have an impact on fairness as well. So fairness will be improved as well. We don't have hard numbers, unfortunately, but this is part of an ongoing research that we are working on now, determining the right buffers for when we have flows that are from heterogeneous congestion control algorithms. And specifically, we are focusing on the recent ones, BBR1 and BBR2. But yeah, what we've seen, we did a lot of tests really, and other than those that we show you here, most of the time short buffers are better for both versions of BBR. And even sometimes for cubic, as we know, when we increase the number of flows, short buffers are good. But I think it depends at the end on the deployment, on what kind of traffic you're seeing. There's a lot of factors that that takes into account when we specify the buffer size.
Yeah. Okay. And then one quick last question. I want to let other people ask questions. I was wondering if you'd played with any of the other NetM loss models besides just random. I was thinking of starting to play with what they call the GE model, loss model, and I was wondering if that's worth doing.
No, actually, we didn't play with that yet. Yeah, we just used the random loss model.
Okay.
We're not familiar with the other ones.
I'm not either, but it looked interesting and I want to play with it.
That's good that you gave us a lot of nice suggestions that we think will improve this and we'll have more different scenarios.
Sure. Yep.
Thank you.
Okay, that's all I got.
Thanks.
So
yeah, thanks, Brian. So that's a really good point about the loss model, and I hadn't been thinking about that as well. But it sort of fits, right? A random loss. Do we really see random loss much? It seems like all the loss patterns that we see in practice have specific patterns that are associated with them. So I'm wondering if that would produce any different results.
Yeah, that's definitely correct. I think that if I remember well, when we were working on some of the labs for NetM, it has the option of specifying some correlation coefficient and stuff that will make you customize more your losses. But I don't know if you can make it in the same distribution as you see, for example, in a loss-based congestion control. But yeah, it's mostly random, and you can tweak how random it is. You can tweak the randomness, I would say.
So just once, this is Jorge again, 1 second, Elie. Back to the buffer question of Brian. If you go to, you have some numbers in your first figure, first or second test, go back all the way, that one, the first one. Actually, you showed that you have better result with the small buffers. If you just if you consider BBR1 and 2, on the very left, you have 0.01, very small buffer. On the very right, you have 100 BDP of buffer, extremely large buffer. So throughput is almost the same. Let's say, take BBR version 1. On the very left, you have 9.4 megabits per second on average. On the right, you have 9.1, which is kind of the same, but not that different. But look at the fairness. The fairness goes all the way from 96%, which is very fair, to 33%, which is very poor. So really, what, on my opinion, is that this is telling you that small buffers are much better. I mean, in terms of throughput, will be almost the same, but if you have competing flows, you will have bad fairness with large buffers. That's what I'm seeing here. Do you agree with this assessment?
Yeah, that's correct. When I was referring that we don't have hard numbers, like in the sense of how much buffering in millisecond you need for the hardware, but definitely with short buffers, always BBR1 and BBR2 perform really well. Yeah, what you're saying is completely accurate.
Okay, well, good line of conversation there. So in the chat room, there's been some other things I'll just point out here if people want to weigh in. So Brad brought up a question that was mostly for people who are in operations and deployment. Has anyone seen research systems beginning to migrate towards BBR, and what tool sets may need to be deployed on DTNs to sort of make them take advantage of that? And Simon points out that, you know, if things can use TCP, they should be able to use BBR. But right now, and I'd agree with Simon on this, is that until it becomes easier to deploy it at the kernel level, you know, it's still that people are probably not migrating that direction. I guess I can ask you guys, how hard was it to sort of get the kernel compiled and configured with this? I know it was challenging in the beginning. It's probably gotten a little bit easier.
Yeah, I can answer that because this is independently of this result, we are deploying a Science DMC at the University of South Carolina. And it was pretty straightforward to install BBR version 1. We didn't test with BBR version 2. And we have results in a production Science DMC transferring data from South Carolina to, I believe it's California. And our connection goes to from South Carolina to Atlanta, from Atlanta to the West Coast. Performance-wise, it's much better BBR version 1. I don't have the numbers, but I think we were able to probably double the performance. If I remember well, we were able to get around between, if I remember, 20, 30 gigabits per second from the East Coast to the West Coast. And the performance, if you just use cubic or I think it's cubic. I'm thinking maybe HTCP was the other one that we test. We will not be able to get above 10. I think in those lines is the type of performance that we are seeing in the production network. That's my experience.
Yeah, great. Thanks for sharing that. And then the last couple of comments here were just about if anybody is using it in production. It sounds like PRP had some use cases that were out there. But for the most part right now, I think that a DTN at a computing facility is most likely just going to be plain old TCP until there's a little bit more seat time. But we're a lot further than we were a couple of years ago, so it'll begin to start trickling out there as people get more experience. So I'll put out a last call for questions if anybody has anything else, and I'll thank Elie, Jose, and Jorge one more time. Great talk. Send me the slides when you get a chance. I'll make sure that those get posted. Okay, and Simon's pointing out alternative to the fairness index. Have you guys looked at an alternative to Jane's fairness index?
No, we didn't. Yeah, we just used the old way of computing the fairness.
Okay. And Michael pointed out that he has a Debian host with a BBR kernel. So that was pretty easy to deploy.
Yeah, and also to add on the deployability or availability of the congestion control, I would say BBR1 is fairly simple. There's a lot of already built kernel. You can just install them and it has BBR1 in them. BBR2 is a little bit more challenging because it's still in its alpha version. It's not yet approved. So if you want to do the test, you have to get the Linux tree and then compile it and then install your kernel. Although I would like to also point that some people already compiled a kernel with BBR2, for example, this specific version, and you can just really install it and test it out without even having to compile anything. So that would also make it easier if you want to play around with different test scenarios.
Okay. And looks like one more comment and one more question. I'll do the comment first. Phil points out that if you haven't done so, using some experiments with competing UDP traffic, particularly to emulate video, since we're in a video world now, have you guys tried some of that?
No, we just focused on large TCP flows. Yeah, we didn't consider UDP or shorter flows.
Okay. And then Stuart wanted to know, from a larger perspective, are we concerned that deployment of BBR will starve existing clients? I think that the jury is still out on that one. I know that Brian's talk from earlier in the year looked into that a little bit. I don't know if you're still listening, Brian, if you had anything to add on that.
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah, I don't. I'm still trying to decide what I think about that. It's a hard question. I think there's maybe some concern. And I find it really interesting that maybe that concern can be mitigated by smaller buffers. And then of course, pacing can help a lot too. So if you're in like on a DTN, if you know that 90% of your DTN flows are 4 by parallel, you could just pace it, and a lot of the fairness issues go away. But it's a hard question, and it's hard to measure if that's happening, right? It's really hard to know for sure that that's what's going on.
Yep. No great answers yet, but good research in the area. All right, I think we've hit the end here. So thank you again to everybody for participating. A lot of good discussion on this, and hopefully some good research directions for you guys for the next paper.
Thank you, Jason.
All right, so there will not be a talk next week for those that are still here because of the holiday, but we're going to pick up again on what week would that be? April 9th. And I believe that is going to be Greg Veldman from Purdue, and he's going to be talking a little bit about multi-factor authentication. So hope everybody has a good off week, and we'll talk to everybody soon.